Joe Rogan has been in the news lately. People have been talking about him a lot. It's been getting around a little bit. People have been talking, and a lot of arguments have been happening online, and even in the more contemporary mainstream political space, about whether or not Joe Rogan's platforming of certain people has been responsible. Most notably, people who are maybe a little bit questioning of the mainstream opinion on COVID. Now, here's the reality of it. Joe Rogan is not very good at responsible platforming. He really just isn't. He will have anybody he likes in his show. If he finds the conversation interesting or he thinks that it'll do well for the show, he'll have them on. He doesn't really care about pushing back against whatever they're saying. He definitely has his biases, but the main issue that I have with Joe Rogan is how readily and unapologetically he platforms anyone from like plenty of cool people to just the absolute worst people, you know? And Joe Rogan has the largest podcast in the world. He has tens of millions, right? Tens of millions of people that watch, every single episode of his podcast. So there is some level of responsibility that I think a figure with such a massive amount of reach owes to their audience. I do not like Joe Rogan, okay? I do not care for Joe Rogan. Not in the I don't hate Joe Rogan as a person or anything. There are no qualities about Joe Rogan that are appealing to me. I don't think he's like a funny or an interesting guy or anything like that. That's not like if I want to watch an episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, Joe Rogan's not the reason I'm watching it. Okay. Joe Rogan's great at one thing when it comes to his podcast, okay? And I think this is why his podcast has become so large. I think it's actually why Joe Rogan became so famous in the first place, though I think the cult of personality built around him is probably not warranted. I don't think he deserves the cult of personality that's been built around him. I think the reason why he's grown so much and why he has the largest podcast on earth is because he's an amazing interviewer. I think whether you like Joe Rogan or not, you have to give him credit. Okay? The guy is an amazing interviewer. He really, really is. I can't show any Joe Rogan clips on stream because, they're copyrighted and I'll get fucking sussed out of existence, so we're not going to do that. But just to give you an example for, Joe Rogan had this one actual scientist or an actual physicist or something on his show. And they were talking about some serious science stuff, I think quantum suicide or quantum death or whatever. Something I've talked about on stream recently, I think. And they were talking about that, and I watched it recently. I haven't really watched much Joe Rogan. Most of the Joe Rogan I'd watched up until recently was actually segments that I was covering on stream and debunking. But this was the first time I'd actually seen an interesting Joe Rogan segment pop up in my recommended, and I ended up watching it. And this was a few days ago. And I listened to it, and I really enjoyed it. And I noticed, this really, really smart dude, this is a smart guy that's being interviewed here that I wish I could talk to because I have a million questions I would ask this guy if I could just talk to him directly. And I was thinking that going into the interview. But Joe Rogan literally asked every question I would have asked. And by the end of that episode of his podcast, I don't think there would be any questions I'd have left to ask that guy. Which is pretty rare of an interview like that, you know? The vast majority of people, I'm sure, don't watch Joe Rogan's podcast because Joe Rogan's that interesting of a guy. I'm sure if every episode of Joe Rogan's podcast was just Joe Rogan talking to himself, or just talking about stuff, or even just talking with a guest, and it was the same guest every day, another figure on par with Joe Rogan, I don't even know if that podcast would be as big as it is now. I think the thing about Joe Rogan's podcast, the reason that it's so big is that it's the biggest podcast. I think it's self-sustaining at this point. Joe Rogan's podcast is the podcast you go to if you want to see your favorite celebrity on a podcast. If you're the average person and somebody that you follow appeared on a podcast and you want to watch that podcast, or somebody that you want to hear from, or somebody you're interested in talked on a podcast and you want to hear it, chances are the podcast they appeared on was the Joe Rogan Experience, because it's number one. which means you constantly have an influx of new people being introduced to Joe Rogan. And the vast majority of Joe Rogan episodes are not that problematic. They really, really are not that problematic. They're just, I'm being, not a single issue. There wasn't a single issue in that one science one I watched. Yesterday, I watched an episode of JRE where he interviewed Daryl... What's his name? It's Daryl something. I can't remember his last name. He's a black guy who became famous for de-radicalizing a bunch of guys from the KKK. I can't remember his last name, but he did Daryl A. Davis. Yes, thank you. I thought it was Davis, but I wasn't 100% sure. Yeah, he did an episode with that guy, and it was a really, really insightful and interesting episode. He told, like, I was immersed in the story he was telling about when he went to the bar to meet, like, this fucking high-up member of the KKK for an interview, and the KKK guy did not know that he was black before the interview. So he was like, it was kind of like there's some tension there too. Like, it was a very, very, very interesting story and a very good episode of the episode. And it's very clear, like, it's a very clear anti-racist message to the episode. But nonetheless, you know, just a few episodes later, let's say Joe Rogan platforms some doctor who's been laughed out of the academic, like, scene for proposing some theories about race and IQ, maybe, you know? There's nothing stopping Joe Rogan from doing something like that. Didn't Joe Rogan have the author of The Bell Curve on his show? Wait, I'm almost certain Joe Rogan had one of the authors of The Bell Curve on his podcast, did he not? Has he not platformed literal race realism before? I may be wrong here, but I feel like he did. I feel like I heard this like a while ago. I may be wrong, but what I'm saying here is he's done things quite similar to that, okay? As far as, like, the vaccine stuff goes and, like, LGBT issues, he's platformed a lot of misinformation and a lot of downright hateful stuff as well, which, frankly, I think is a little bit less concerning than the misinformation. I'm not concerned with people disagreeing with me. Like, I don't think that people should be censored for disagreeing with me. I think people should be censored for spreading misinformation. Depending on the context, of course. I mean, obviously you're allowed to be wrong, but I think when you actively and knowingly and maliciously spread misinformation about an important topic, like a public health issue, like a pandemic, to your audience, I think maybe there should be some accountability held to you there on the account of the platforms that host your content. Now we got to get around to the Joe Rogan stuff. This is where my hot take comes about. A lot of people on the left right now, and when I say the left, I mean, like, not just communists and socialists and stuff like that. I mean Democrat types, like liberals and stuff like that, popular celebrities that are kind of left-leaning. Tons of people are calling for Spotify, who had like $100 million like exclusivity deal with Joe Rogan, by the way, are calling for Spotify to just get rid of Joe Rogan for his platforming of anti-vax stuff and the narratives that he spread. And this has led to an absolute fucking meltdown. Just last night, I watched a debate between Vosh and Schuonhead, or not a debate, but a more of like Vosh covering something Schuonhead said in sort of like a debatey format of Schuonhead criticizing lefties who want to have Joe Rogan deplatformed. I think I'm actually going to fall not quite in the middle, but not quite on either of their positions in this scenario, because I think their argument is a pretty good representation of the broader narrative and the broader discourse happening about Joe Rogan and his platforming online right now. I think the answer to this question can't be black or white. The answer to this question can't be leaving Joe Rogan on these platforms as he is now, platforming misinformation and having the effect he's having. If you genuinely feel like right now the effect he's having is a positive one and that nothing should be done about it, then I don't know what to tell you. You just don't believe in trying to make the world a better place. Why are you interested in politics? Why are you involved in politics if you have that position? But I also don't think the answer is banning him. What is my big brain based out of the box opinion on how we answer the Joe Rogan question? What is my outside of the box solution? We can't ban Joe Rogan. We can't vie for getting Joe Rogan banned. It's political suicide. I'm sorry. Guys, listen to my whole take before you guys say you disagree or I'll fucking ban you. And do you guys want to know why? Joe Rogan is the #1 podcast in the fucking world. Okay? The number one podcast in the fucking world. He has so much reach and such a massive audience and such a sycophantic audience, many of which aren't even that politically like radical. They're just like normies who have some pretty shitty opinions because the political knowledge they get is from Joe Rogan. Like they aren't even that politically like aware. They're not even like that right wing even. They just have some shitty opinions because they get their politics from Joe Rogan, right? And the guests he has on. Here's my problem though. Did you notice like what happened with Shuanhead and Vosh because of the prospect of Joe Rogan getting banned? Like how much that pissed off someone who is left-leaning but is as normie-minded. Like if you want to get a gauge on how like normies are going to react to an issue, look at how Shuanhead reacts to an issue. No hate to Shuanhead, but like if you want to get an idea of how the general public would react to something, look at how Shuanhead reacts to it, and that should give you a good gauge on how the average person will react to like a certain event, right? People love Joe Rogan. And if Joe Rogan himself, and the right especially, are able to say the left got Joe Rogan banned, the left got the most popular, beloved podcast in the world banned, deplatformed one of the most beloved figures in the fucking country, and got him banned, it would be political suicide. It would be political suicide. Unfortunately, it seems the solution here is one that isn't very practical to actually achieve. The real solution here is we have to change Joe Rogan's mind. The real solution is that large figures on the left need to stop being such bitches about defending their positions and start using their online platform to vie to get on Joe Rogan, okay? Joe Rogan has random online figures and sometimes even nobodies on his podcast all the time. He does like, what does he do? Like a weekly podcast? How much? It's like weekly, right? If it's a week or any more, then what I'm about to say will apply. He has to get a guest for every week. That, like, granted, it is the biggest podcast in the world, but you have to get interesting guests who are going to be able to bring interesting perspectives and bring in viewership and be entertaining. If you're a large figure out there and you're watching this, or hell, if you're an audience member of a large figure out there and you aren't constantly putting pressure on your favorite figures to use their platform to push to get onto things like Joe Rogan so that they can defend their positions and spread their ideas and maybe actually convince Joe Rogan that maybe platforming this kind of stuff is a bad idea. Is it possible? No, but I think we should try. Honestly, let's ban Joe Rogan just to show all the lefties demanding he be deplatformed how insanely stupid that would play out and how it would make everything even worse. Yeah, I think there are some like actual practical solutions we can do though, like in the meantime. I think that simple markings for misinformation will probably do the job pretty well. There's a certain like net that you have to like throw and realize that like you don't have to expend that much energy to keep somewhat reasonable people from falling into crazy radical ideologies, right? Like generally, if you put a warning before a video about the Holocaust, about it being misinformation, I feel like most reasonable people are going to like click off the video or not take what, is in the video seriously. Most people that are going to take that video seriously after seeing that warning are already like too far gone, right? And the question is about whether or not it's healthy for somebody like Joe Rogan, who has such a broad normie audience and such a broad media presence, to platform these, and I'm going to be honest, these niche far right or these niche radical conservative figures. Because in many cases, like, let's be real, Jordan Peterson's a big deal, but like, how many people do you think never heard of Jordan Peterson before they saw him on Joe Rogan? I'd be willing to bet millions, considering every episode of his show gets tens of millions of views, okay? Jordan Peterson is a niche internet micro-celebrity in comparison to fucking Joe Rogan, all right? This is serious platforming, okay? Your career can be made by platforming on Joe Rogan, all right? And I do think that when you are that guy, when you are the guy whose podcast being a guest on can kickstart an entire career that can influence millions of people, I think maybe yeah, there is a little bit of responsibility you should have. Is it like maybe a little telling? Is it maybe not a little telling? Okay, that like okay, we usually look to like a lot of our media for like moral messages about the world, I think, generally, right? You know, typically I feel like if we see somebody in the real world acting like a villain from a story that's really popular, usually that's pretty telling about that person. Do you guys agree? Joe Rogan, I feel like, does have a responsibility to his audience. I was saying before, I feel like we get a lot of our moral messages from media, and I feel like, you know, that's probably a good thing, right? Because I feel like a lot of media does have good moral messaging. One of the most famous quotes in all of media is, "With great power comes great responsibility," right? And is that not quite literally applicable to Joe Rogan, who has so much power and yet exercises so little responsibility with said power? Should that basic moral lesson that we all learned from fucking Spider-Man not apply to somebody as powerful as Joe Rogan? Frankly, I'd be willing to bet that Joe Rogan has more power and influence than most American politicians. Most American politicians don't really have that much power in and of themselves. Joe Rogan, though, Joe Rogan, if he wanted to, could organize a riot. Joe Rogan could probably organize a record-breaking protest in the streets of Washington, D.C. if he wanted to. With his platform, if he told his fans for like months ahead and like really shilled for it and told his fans to come protest with me in Washington, D.C. on this date and really shilled for it in all of his episodes for a few months going ahead, I think he would be able to bring out hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. Oh my God. Yeah, look at this. Holy shit. Q3 media ratings, average viewers per show in the millions. So this is from Spotify. The Joe Rogan Experience, 11 million viewers on average per episode, followed in second place by just absolutely fucking destroying second place by several times. Like, what is this? Like 4 times second place being Tucker Carlson Tonight. At 3.24 million, The 5 at 2.98, Hannity at 2.94. Notice how like almost all of these are like right-wing media outlets. It's almost like the vast majority of right-wing media in this country is pretty right-wing. And like the largest figure in this country is like a centrist with a pretty conservative-ish kind of bias in who he platforms typically. Yeah, I feel like this definitely supports my point. Yeah, so basically the thing I'm trying to get across here is that there's a problem here, okay? I think we need to agree that there is a problem here and that we cannot just say, fuck it, Joe Rogan just spreading misinformation to his massive audience with no responsibility is fine. Like, clearly that's a problem. I think we can agree on that. I hope we can agree on it. If we don't, then that's a problem. But if we can agree on that, and we can agree on, like my fellow lefties who want Joe Rogan banned, if we can agree on the fact that banning Joe Rogan outright would be political suicide for the left, it would radicalize a shit ton of Joe Rogan's normie audience who is already maybe a little bit predisposed to conservatism, much further right, and fully on board with the conservative censorship narrative. And not only that, but it would then lead to Joe Rogan becoming a martyr that the right could then build an entire generation of political propaganda on top of, possibly enough to even cause a conservative surge enough to get another Republican elected in this country. I think both those ends of the spectrum, both those solutions, both those possibilities are a problem, and we can do something else. And I think a good start, a good thing Spotify could do, something that lefties could start advocating for now that should not be controversial, and if anybody finds it to be a problem, then they're a piece of shit, would be just misinformation warnings. Just mark each episode of the Joe Rogan Experience that has medical misinformation in it or any misinformation in it, mark it as having misinformation. Hell, when the person that they're having on as a guest is about to say something that's misinformation, hell, even just have a little, what is about to be said is misinformation has been debunked. The real truth, like have like a robot voice read off like the Wikipedia page of whatever it is right before they say it or something. Like do something that makes it so they're not being deplatformed, but they are being forced to engage with the truth. All right? That's my favorite thing. I'm actually, as time goes by, I'm getting less and less in favor of deplatforming these conservative figures, and I'm becoming more and more in favor of them being forced and being put into situations where they're unable to ignore the fact that reality disagrees with their opinions. When YouTube is putting like a fucking plaque beneath their videos that says it's misinformation and linking Wikipedia that's debunking what they said. Stuff like that, I fucking love that. Deplatforming creates martyrs, but putting little plaques calling out misinformation acts as a deterrent to people who are reasonable to the content to not be radicalized further, as well as humiliating the content creator in the eyes of the left. Whenever we're able to point to a right-wing content creator who has plaques beneath their video marking it as misinformation, that's a win for us. That's a fucking up on our end, you know? I don't know. Anyway, hopefully you guys don't cancel me for it. That is my hot take on Joe Rogan. If you enjoyed, please consider leaving a like. It really helps a lot more than you even realize, the stream and the video, and it's completely free and only takes a second, so consider hitting that like button. And if you want to see more from me on this beloved health site, then please consider subscribing or ringing the bell icon so YouTube actually tells you when I go live or upload a new video or anything like that. And of course, if you want to see more from me, then you can follow my social media, all linked down below, of course, including my Instagram, my TikTok, my Twitter, and of course my fan Discord, where you'll find me lurking around and, you know, playing video games and doing watch parties and stuff like that. It's a great community, so come join. And of course, finally, if you want to support me financially like all the lovely people in the chat have today, then please consider donating, subscribing, or gifting a sub over on my website, xanderhall.com/live, super chatting over on YouTube, subscribing or gifting a sub or prime subbing for free with Amazon Prime over on Twitch, or even donating through Streamlabs. With all that said, no matter how you support me, thank you all so much for watching, and have a good one.